Hi, Misha here, and this is another episode of Storytime, talking about how a collection, even perhaps a little bit of an obsession, began for me with Swiss military-type firearms. Of course, in recent years, that's led to me owning guns like this PE-90, as well as other members in its family. But it all actually started with this gun here, and thanks to really one man, at least in the very beginning. And recently, he joined us after a long absence out shooting, including bringing one of his K-31s. So here's a small bit of footage of that for old time's sake. K-31. That's how we got. Now, I met him 20 years ago in college, and he was the first one to put a K-31 in my hands. And that would have been one of the first straight pulls I really messed with, as well as one of the first Swiss rifles, Swiss firearms. And it was actually a very good time to get into them, because when he bought his first few in the 90s, they were about $300. That sounds cheap, but it back then was not considered cheap at all. But Century Arms just brought in a batch, and believe it or not, they were selling them for $89.95. It's hard to even get that out. Under $100 shipped. So it was a great time to buy a K-31. I think a major reason that they weren't more money was the ammunition. They fired 7.5 by 55, 7.5 millimeter Gewehr Patron 1911 GP11. A very good cartridge, and it's not as rare as many in the U.S. Others, like Arisakas you might come across, but especially 20 years ago, it wasn't especially common either. And after finally picking one of these up, I was in love, and this was my gateway gun, if you will, into the world of lots of milsurp, but Swiss in particular. And yeah, the ultimate culmination would be these SG 550s. And that's what I've kind of joked with people. It's deceptive. Some Swiss guns are very affordable, especially considering the high quality you get. But then you start getting into other Swiss guns, and the price goes up quite rapidly. So yeah, let's just talk a little bit more about what this is, and I'll give you a few more anecdotes. Now, the K-31 is oft called the Schmidt-Rubin, even by myself. It's a shorthand. Today, in America, Schmidt-Rubin usually just stands for straight pull Swiss, especially straight pull Swiss firing the GP11 cartridge. But this really is not, as you know. Here is a true Schmidt-Rubin. This is the K11, and this is what the K-31 replaced. This is by definition a carbine, although quite a long one by carbine standards, and this is by definition a short rifle. The Swiss had some interesting requirements. They had the standard full-size 1911 rifle, and they had this K11 carbine. The K11 was 43.5 inches long, 8.5 pounds, and it had a barrel just around 23 inches. They liked this for bicycle troops and artillery crews, but they felt that the 1911 was still better suited for fortress guards, other people that might be shooting at long range in the Swiss mountains. But around 1929, a new request went out for a standard short rifle to replace both the carbine and the rifle. it needed to have the accuracy of the rifle, but the size of the carbine, and that's how we get the K-31. This is 43.5 inches long, same as the K-11. It does weigh a little bit more at about 8.75 pounds. But the main advantage, it has a longer barrel. It's a bit over 25.5 inches long. Well, how did they manage to cram 2.5 inches extra barrel into an overall length the same? Well, that really does get to the difference between a Schmidt-Rubin and a K-31. Yes, both are straight pulls for the same caliber, made in Switzerland for the Army. But you'll notice right off the bat, the K-11, the true Schmidt-Rubin bolt, is quite a bit longer than the K-31 bolt. Same operating principle, but with the K-31, they move the lugs all the way forward versus the sleeve in the middle here, and they just pretty much eliminated this whole forward section. This made the K-31 bolt stronger. It was also made easier to mass produce. You notice there's a sheet steel caulking guide here versus a machined steel one here. They went from a Bakelite caulking handle to an alloy one. It also was stronger, so faster, easier, cheaper to produce, and stronger overall. And so they had a lot of really length and weight savings in the receivers. Here are the actions opened up. Here's the K-11, the true Schmidt-Rubin. And here is the K-31. It's a much shorter receiver. Also doesn't have the type of lightning cuts like the K-11. So the receiver itself was cheaper and easier to mass produce. They also updated the magazine. Both still hold 6 rounds. Here's the original Schmidt-Rubin. Here's the K-31. This has a much simplified single-piece body, at least the floor plate, whereas this has the lips and stuff machined in. These are also a little more interchangeable, but generally speaking, just easier to mass produce. And they would actually make spare mags for these, even though they usually topped them off with stripper clips. Swiss would carry around spare mags, especially in the K-31 era. And the barrels would be different too. The earliest prototypes for what would become the new short rifle were basically K-11s fitted with heavy profile barrels. Okay, fine. They gave them a little bit greater accuracy, but also greater weight. Now this rifle was primarily developed by Waffenfabrik Bern. And their next attempt was to go to a somewhat heavier barrel by a little bit, but more importantly, a free floated barrel. And this, combined with the extra couple of inches by shortening the receiver, gave them the accuracy they desired. The first 200 or so trials guns were delivered in May of 1931, hence the designation. And after about a year of testing, it was accepted for Swiss military service the next year and was put into full production by 1933 and started to see some use. It was also in 1933 that the K-11 was taken out of production, and the following year, 1934, they would take the old Gewehr Patron 90, GP90 cartridge out of service, pretty much going to all GP11. Now for the K-11, they would do about 185,000 new production examples from 1913 up through 1933. Yeah, pretty good number. They would also convert about 26,000 older 1900 and 1905s, meaning, roughly speaking, they had about 210,000 carbines to the K-11 standard. But since the K-31 was a short rifle, expected to be issued to pretty much everyone needing a rifle. They would build a large number more. Between the beginning of production and when the last ones were turned out in 1958, they would produce over 525,000 pieces. And yeah, it was the standard service gun and remained virtually unchanged throughout its entire production run. The only notable difference is that in 1946 they would change from walnut to beech furniture. There were a few advantages to this, but mostly supply. Otherwise, yeah, there are very minor differences. And I should say that between the K11 and the K31, there are a few other differences. The sights were slightly updated. The triggers were improved. Still uses the ring safety. Still has the side sling mounts. The butt plates change a little bit. Yeah, externally, you could be forgiven for mistaking them. If you're just looking, the easiest ways to tell them apart are either by the magazine base plate or the cocking handle, the synthetic versus the metal. And yeah, they were a huge success for Switzerland. Given their army, they were durable and reliable. Now, this would not have been a good gun for, say, Russian conscripts fighting on the Eastern Front. This was meant for a well-trained military that took care of its guns, took them home, kept them relatively clean. Basically, if they treated them right, the rifles would treat them right. They were very reliable when clean, but yeah, because of the tight fitment of the action, not always the most resistant to things, although they did go through a lot of cold and snow and ice testing, as you would expect. Not so much mud, though. It's also worth pointing out that there aren't a lot of markings on really a lot of Swiss guns. You have the cross, the crest, you have a serial number, and often, aside from a few proof marks, that's about it. You don't actually have a model name stamped into most Swiss guns. That even continues today with their STGW 90s. Now, when I finally picked up my first K-31 for myself, not just shooting docs, it wasn't the only inexpensive and historical bolt-action Century had for under $100. In fact, it wasn't even the only straight pull. We also have the Austro-Hungarian Steyr, also made by what we know as FEG, M95 Mannlicher. And most of these that came in were short rifles, carbines. This is a carbine. Their differences, their distinction, were really just sling swivel placement. So I picked up both at the same time. They were both $89 for same condition from Century. And this too fires a bit of an obscure round, 8x56R. Originally it fired 8x50R, but then they were reworked for the newer Spitzer cartridge. Now back in the day, the ammo was quite affordable because a large batch had been imported along with the guns. Today though, the ammo has dried up. That's why the Mannlichers here have really not gone up in price too much. But the availability of GP11 has stayed constant or even improved a bit. And with their reputation too, the Swiss guns have gone up quite a bit more than the Mannlichers. But I picked up both, and I like both. They're very different guns. Whereas the Swiss is a finely honed machine designed to be built in the hundreds of thousands. So it has a pretty high initial cost, but they expected it to last decades. The Mannlicher was meant to be built in the millions, and these did see service in World War I. They often get a reputation for a very rough bolt. That's a little bit unfair because, in reality, a lot of the ones that have rough bolts here in the US, it's because they've been refurbished, or sometimes the bolts don't actually match the receivers when they're actually meant to be with the gun and well worn in. They are yeah, pretty smooth. They have a safety on the side that locks in. And a perfectly okay trigger. Now comparing that to the Swiss, yeah, this is going to be a smoother bolt system. Of course, they also have a last round hold open, as you saw in the shooting clip. It's a more refined action, no doubt about it. And these have better triggers too. But the Mannlicher does get a bit of an unfair reputation because of some of the guns that have been imported that were refurbished. Sometimes numbers don't match, what have you. It's a really fun bolt gun too. And of course it uses the little Mannlicher clips that you load in from the top and they eject out the bottom when empty. That's kind of what Mannlicher was, Ferdinand von Mannlicher was famous for, was his clipazine system. And yeah, these are my first two straight pulls. Now there aren't a ton of straight pulls available. Obviously the turn bolt system kind of won out, but there were some straight pulls. And there are a few others like the Ross and the Lee Navy. But these kind of things start off collections. And that was kind of how surplus was back then. Under $100 for a nice condition gun, and you could get surplus ammo. Doc taught me how to clean corrosive, told me all about that. One fun thing, the troop tags and the butt plates of Swiss guns. When I showed a few people that feature of the Swiss guns specifically, I heard them telling people to always take the butt plates off of any milsurp gun to check for a tag, and I had to kind of pull them back and go, no, that's kind of a thing more or less unique to Switzerland. Although if you do have a gun that has a storage compartment in the buttstock, always check it. I've found some pretty weird and sometimes very cool things in those compartments. You never know what a soldier might have stuffed in. But yeah, I've always liked milsurp, and it was affordable and a great entryway into firearms that a college student could really budget for. And I have quite a few of mine. Of course, these were not my first. My first was a Mosin, like most of yours. But really guns that I'm happy to have. The K-31 served Switzerland as its primary frontline rifle for a quarter century, and then in limited service for years afterwards. It was replaced by this, the STGW-57 in 1957, and it too would serve for roughly a quarter century before being replaced by the STGW-90, which that PE-90 you saw at the beginning is a semi-automatic version of, which in turn has served for just over a quarter century. So you can kind of see the progression. Now this AM-57, which is a PE-57 kit on a U.S. receiver, is built by my friend Steve. And it's kind of one of the things we bonded over, was a love of Swiss guns. And down here we have the Steyr STG-58. This is a FAL clone, built from an original kit on a U.S. receiver, DSA I believe. And this is what replaced the Steyr Mannlicher. And I brought this out to wrap the video up with, only to mention that the same individual who got me into K-31s is the one who also got me into FALs. He helped me build my first two. One was an L1A1, and the other was actually an STGW-58 kit. So it all kind of flows together, you know. But that's the kind of people that influenced me when I was in college, and I think I'm better for it. You know, getting into guns, it does kind of keep you on the straight and narrow, at least to some extent. You know, not breaking the law too much. It's something to do. It's mechanically interesting. And yeah, he definitely spurred me on for FALs. But that's kind of a story for another day. But since he was out joining us and we had a shooting clip, I thought, why don't I do a video giving a little more story time background and just talking about a fun gun that a lot of people also love and respect. So with that, feel free to comment below, leave your own stories. And if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the link to our Patreon page. With that, this is Misha, and we'll catch you very soon next time.